These are not just horror movies. These are the films governments tried to bury, not because they failed, but because they went too far. Across the 1980s, authorities seized tapes, raided stores, and prosecuted distributors in a panic that turned cinema into contraband. What you are about to see is not a list of scary movies. It is a list of films so disturbing they were treated like dangerous evidence. Number 15, Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. This is not just a horror film. This is the moment when cinema crossed a line and governments panicked because they could not tell what was real anymore. When Cannibal Holocaust first surfaced, it did not arrive like a movie. It arrived like evidence. Shot in a raw documentary style, the film follows a missing crew in the Amazon, whose recovered footage reveals acts so violent that audiences believed they were witnessing actual murder. That belief was not limited to viewers. Italian authorities arrested director Ruggero Deodato and charged him with making a snuff film. Courts demanded proof that the actors were alive. But the horror did not stop at the courtroom. Countries across Europe banned it outright. Prints were seized, distribution was crushed. The British Video Nasties list treated it like a dangerous object rather than entertainment. Even decades later, the film remains censored in multiple regions. What makes this case terrifying is not just the violence, it is the reaction. Governments did not simply reject it, they tried to erase it completely. And that tells you everything about how powerful this film really was. Number 14, The Driller Killer, 1979. Before the panic had a name, there was one film that quietly triggered it. Not with monsters, not with demons, but with something far more uncomfortable. Reality breaking down in a filthy apartment. The Driller Killer follows a struggling artist in New York whose sanity collapses under pressure. What begins as a character study slowly mutates into something uglier. The violence is sudden, brutal, unpolished, and that rawness made it feel dangerously real. When the film reached the United Kingdom in the early 80s, it became one of the first titles to be targeted during the Video Nasties crackdown. Authorities seized tapes from shops. Distributors faced prosecution. On the cover art alone was treated like a threat to public safety. It was no longer about content. It was about control. But here is where things get more unsettling. The outrage was not entirely about what was on screen. It was about who might watch it. Politicians feared that ordinary people exposed to this level of violence would lose moral boundaries. That fear turned a low-budget horror film into a national controversy. And just like that, the film was pulled from circulation, not because it failed, but because it scared the wrong people. Number 13, I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. Some films are banned because they are violent. Others are banned because they are disturbing. This one was banned because it made people deeply uncomfortable in a way they could not easily explain. I Spit on Your Grave is not structured like a traditional horror story. There is no supernatural force, no escape, just a slow descent into cruelty followed by an equally brutal revenge. The film forces the audience to sit through prolonged suffering and then confront the consequences without relief or distance. When it entered the UK market during the early 80s, it became one of the most aggressively targeted titles in the Video Nasties crackdown. Authorities did not just restrict it, they prosecuted distributors. They treated the film as morally dangerous material that could corrupt viewers. It was labeled obscene, degrading, unfit for public consumption. What made the situation even more volatile was the debate around its intent. Some argued it was a commentary on violence. Others saw it as exploitation. Governments didn't wait for that debate to settle. They acted first. Copies were seized. The film was effectively erased from shelves, and in doing so, they turned it into something far more powerful than a movie. They turned it into a symbol of fear. Number 12, The Evil Dead, 1981. It started as a low-budget experiment. A group of friends, a remote cabin, a camera moving like something alive. Nobody expected it to become one of the most hunted horror films of its time. The Evil Dead feels chaotic from the first moment. The camera does not observe, it attacks. The violence is exaggerated, yet relentless. Bodies twist, blood flows in impossible quantities. The experience is designed to overwhelm rather than comfort. When it arrived in the United Kingdom, it quickly landed on the Video Nasties list. But unlike many others, this film became a legal battleground. Distributors were prosecuted, copies were confiscated. The government treated it as a genuine threat to public morality rather than simple entertainment. What is fascinating is how the film was perceived at the time. Critics did not see artistry, they saw excess. Authorities did not see creativity, they saw danger. The idea that a film could influence behavior was taken seriously enough to justify legal action. Yet the attempt to suppress it had the opposite effect. The controversy amplified its reputation. It became more than a horror film. It became a forbidden experience. And once something becomes forbidden, it stops being just a movie. It becomes an obsession. Number 11, Possession, 1981. This is not a film that scares you in a traditional way. It unsettles you slowly until you realize something inside the story feels completely broken. Possession begins like a domestic drama, a marriage collapsing in cold silence, suspicion growing in small gestures. But then the film fractures. Reality starts slipping. Emotion turns violent. And what follows is not just horror. It is psychological disintegration captured on screen. The performance at the center feels almost dangerous. Characters scream without control. Movements feel erratic. The infamous subway scene alone became one of the most disturbing sequences ever filmed. It was not polished, it was raw. And that rawness made authorities deeply uncomfortable. When the film reached the United Kingdom, it did not receive a simple classification. It was banned outright for years. Officials did not trust it to be shown publicly. The tone was too chaotic, the imagery too extreme, and the emotional intensity too unpredictable. But what truly made governments wary was not just what the film showed, it was what it suggested. This was horror without clear rules, no safe distance, no clean explanation. It blurred the line between mental breakdown and supernatural terror so effectively that it felt unstable. And unstable art is something authorities rarely tolerate, because when a film stops behaving like a film, it becomes something harder to control, something that lingers long after the screen goes dark. Number 10, Cannibal Ferox, 1981. Some films are controversial, others are outright rejected. And then there are films that governments attempt to wipe out entirely. Cannibal Ferox belongs to that final category. Marketed as more extreme than anything before it, the film did not hide its intentions. It pushed violence to a level that many believed should never be shown at all. Set deep in the Amazon, the story follows a group of outsiders who encounter a brutal tribe. What unfolds is not adventure. It is punishment. Scenes of torture linger. Pain is not implied. It is displayed in detail. The camera does not look away. And that decision is exactly what triggered global backlash. Authorities across multiple countries responded aggressively. The film was banned in over 30 nations, not restricted, not edited, completely outlawed. Governments seized prints, distribution chains were shut down. Owning a copy in certain regions could even lead to legal consequences. What makes this case unique is how unified the reaction was. Different countries with different laws reached the same conclusion. This film could not be allowed to circulate freely. Critics described it as excessive. Authorities described it as dangerous. And audiences who managed to see it described something even more disturbing, not just violence, but a deliberate attempt to provoke and disturb at the deepest level. And when a film is designed to provoke rather than entertain it, becomes unpredictable. That unpredictability is what governments fear the most, because it cannot be easily controlled once it reaches the public. Number 9, The House on the Edge of the Park, 1980. Some films do not rely on monsters, they rely on people, and that is exactly why they become harder to defend. The house on the edge of the park traps its audience in a single location where control slowly shifts from normalcy to terror. What begins as a social gathering quickly turns into a prolonged psychological and physical nightmare. The violence is not stylized. It feels invasive, personal, uncomfortably close. When the film entered the United Kingdom during the height of the Video Nasties panic, it was immediately flagged as dangerous. Authorities saw more than just violent scenes. They saw a narrative that removed safety from everyday spaces, a home, a party. Familiar environments turned hostile without warning. The reaction was swift. The film was banned. Copies were seized. Distribution was effectively halted. It was grouped with the most extreme titles of the era and treated as material that should not be accessible to the public. What made this case particularly unsettling was the tone. There is no fantasy element to soften the impact, no supernatural distance. The horror is grounded in human behavior. That makes it feel possible. And anything that feels possible is far more threatening than something imaginary. Governments did not just reject the film. They feared its implications. The idea that violence could emerge from ordinary situations without warning created a kind of discomfort that censorship alone could not fully contain. And that is why this film was not simply criticized. It was removed. Number 8. Tenebre, 1982. There is a difference between showing violence and examining it. This film does both, and that combination made it deeply unsettling for those trying to control what audiences could see. Tenebre follows a writer whose fiction begins to mirror real murders. The story unfolds like a puzzle, but every piece reveals something darker about obsession and perception. The violence is precise, calculated, almost clinical in its presentation. When the film reached British censors, it did not pass quietly. It was heavily cut, scenes were removed, and even those altered versions were treated with suspicion. The film was seized under the Video Nasties crackdown and became one of the most debated titles of the era. What disturbed authorities was not just the imagery, it was the perspective. The film invites the viewer to engage with the act of watching itself. It forces questions about why violence is consumed, why it fascinates, why it sells. That level of self-awareness created discomfort beyond simple censorship. Because now the film was not just showing violence, it was reflecting it back at the audience, and by extension, at the society trying to regulate it. Governments prefer clear lines, acceptable or unacceptable, safe or dangerous. But this film blurred those lines completely. It existed in a space where morality felt unstable. And when morality becomes uncertain, the easiest response is removal. So that is exactly what happened. Cuts were enforced, access was restricted, and the film was pushed into the shadows. But once something is pushed into the shadows, it often becomes more visible than ever. Number 7. The New York Ripper, 1982. Some films disturb you, others offend you. And then there are films that cross a threshold where governments decide they should not exist in public at all. The New York Ripper is built around a series of brutal killings in a city that feels cold and indifferent. The violence is not stylized. It is explicit, prolonged, and deliberately uncomfortable. The film forces the viewer to confront acts that feel invasive rather than entertaining. When it reached censors in the United Kingdom and Australia, the response was immediate and uncompromising. The film was banned outright, not edited, not negotiated, completely prohibited. Authorities classified it as excessively sadistic and morally corrosive. It was treated as material that could not be justified under any circumstance. What made the reaction so severe was the tone. There is no clear sense of justice or balance. The violence feels arbitrary. The victims feel vulnerable in a way that mirrors real life rather than fiction. That realism created a level of discomfort that regulators were not willing to tolerate. The film quickly became part of the Video Nasties controversy, but stood out even within that group. While other films were cut or restricted, this one was rejected entirely. It became an example of where authorities drew the absolute line. And when a line is drawn, that clearly it reveals something important, not just about the film, but about the limits of what society is willing to confront. Because sometimes the most frightening thing is not what is shown, it is what is considered too disturbing to be allowed at all. Number 6. The Burning, 1981. At first glance, this looks like a typical slasher film. A group of young people, a remote summer camp, a killer hiding in the shadows. But the reaction it triggered tells a very different story. The Burning builds its tension slowly before delivering moments of sudden and shocking violence. One sequence in particular became infamous for its intensity and timing. It arrives without warning and leaves no space for relief. When the film was submitted to British censors, it faced heavy resistance. The Board of Film Classification demanded extensive cuts. Scenes were removed or altered to reduce the impact. Even with those changes, the film struggled to secure approval. It was considered too intense for general audiences. During the Video Nasties era, it was effectively suppressed in its original form. Viewers were not allowed to experience the film as it was intended. The government did not ban it outright in every case, but they controlled it so tightly that its full version became inaccessible. What makes this situation interesting is how targeted the censorship was. Authorities focused on specific moments rather than the entire film. They identified scenes that they believed crossed an invisible boundary and removed them with precision. That approach reveals something deeper about how censorship operates. It is not always about eliminating a film completely. Sometimes it is about reshaping it, controlling how it is experienced, deciding what the audience is allowed to feel. And in doing so, they change the film itself. Because once key moments are removed, the story is no longer the same. It becomes something safer, something controlled, but never something whole. Number 5. Nekromantik, 1987. There are films that shock audiences, and then there are films that provoke authorities into direct action. Not warnings, not classifications, actual intervention. Nekromantik does not follow traditional storytelling. It moves through disturbing imagery with a cold detachment that feels intentional. There is no attempt to soften what is being shown, no moral framing, no distance between the viewer and the content. When the film was screened in Germany, the reaction went beyond criticism. Police raided cinemas, prints were confiscated, screenings were shut down. This was not censorship through paperwork. This was enforcement in real time. Authorities classified the film as harmful to public decency. But that explanation only scratches the surface. The real issue was how far the film stepped outside accepted boundaries. It did not just challenge norms, it ignored them completely. That level of disregard created a kind of institutional panic. Regulators were not dealing with a film that pushed limits. They were dealing with something that refused to acknowledge limits at all. The result was a long period of suppression. The film became difficult to access. It circulated in underground markets. It developed a reputation not just as controversial, but as forbidden. And that distinction matters, because once a film is labeled forbidden, it stops being part of normal culture. It becomes something hidden, something whispered about, something people seek out precisely because they are not supposed to see it. And that is exactly what happened here. Number 4. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1986. This is not a film that relies on spectacle. It relies on realism. And that realism made it one of the most difficult films for authorities to accept. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, presents violence in a detached, almost observational way. There is no dramatic buildup, no exaggerated style. Events unfold with a quietness that feels disturbingly ordinary. When the film was completed, it did not enter theaters immediately. Distributors hesitated. Censors pushed back. The lack of moral commentary became a central issue. Authorities were uncomfortable with how the film refused to guide the audience toward a clear judgment. In several regions, the film faced outright bans. In others, it was delayed for years. Ratings boards struggled to categorize it. The violence was not excessive in quantity, but in presentation. It felt real, unfiltered, uncomfortably close to actual events. That closeness is what triggered resistance. Governments are often willing to tolerate stylized horror. It creates distance. It signals fiction. But this film removed that distance entirely. It presented violence as something mundane, something that could exist quietly within society. And that idea was far more unsettling than any exaggerated scene. The suppression that followed was not explosive like other cases. It was slow, controlled, persistent. The film was held back, restricted, kept away from wide audiences for as possible. Because sometimes the most dangerous stories are the ones that feel believable, and this one felt entirely possible. Number 3. Absurd, 1981. Some films were caught in the panic. Others became central to it. This one did not just get banned. It became evidence in the argument that horror films themselves were a threat. Absurd presents a relentless sequence of violence that feels mechanical in its execution. The narrative exists, but it is secondary. What dominates is the repetition of brutality. A killer who does not stop. A structure that does not offer relief. When the film entered the United Kingdom, it was immediately targeted under the Video Nasties crackdown. Authorities did not treat it as a borderline case. They treated it as one of the most extreme examples available. It was successfully prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act. Copies were seized. Distribution was shut down. What made this case particularly significant was how it was used. The film was not just banned. It was cited as proof that unregulated video content could be harmful. It became part of a larger narrative pushed by politicians and media. A narrative that horror films were eroding moral standards. That transformed the film into something larger than itself. It was no longer just a controversial title. It became a symbol, a justification for tighter control, a reason to expand censorship laws. And once a film becomes a symbol, it loses its individual identity. It is no longer judged on its own terms. It is judged on what it represents. In this case, it represented everything authorities feared about the growing home video market, and that fear ensured it would not be allowed to circulate freely. Number 2. Nightmare, 1981. This is where censorship becomes precise, calculated, and completely unforgiving. Nightmare follows a disturbed individual whose violent impulses are tied to psychological trauma. The film does not glamorize the character, but it does not distance the audience either. It places viewers uncomfortably close to the mindset of the killer. When the film reached British authorities, it triggered one of the most aggressive responses of the Video Nasties era. It was prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act. Not debated, not negotiated. Prosecuted. Courts ruled that the film had the potential to deprave and corrupt viewers. That legal language is important. It shows that the concern had moved beyond taste or decency. It had entered the realm of perceived social harm. The idea that watching the film could influence behavior was taken seriously enough to justify criminal charges. Copies were seized from distributors. Retailers were targeted. The film effectively disappeared from legitimate circulation. It became something that existed only in underground markets and whispered conversations. What makes this case stand out is how direct the action was. There was no attempt to edit or soften the material. Authorities chose complete removal, because in their view, there was nothing to salvage. That level of response reveals a shift in how horror was perceived at the time, not as entertainment, not as art, but as something potentially dangerous. And once something is labeled dangerous, the next step is always the same. Eliminate it. Number 1. Don't Go in the Woods, 1981. This is where everything collapses into pure panic. No complex narrative, no layered themes. Just raw survival and relentless violence that refuses to slow down. Don't Go in the Woods strips horror down to its most primitive form. A group of hikers enter a remote wilderness and are hunted without warning. The attacks are sudden, the pacing is chaotic, there is no sense of control. no structured buildup, only the constant threat that something could happen at any moment. When the film reached the United Kingdom, it did not pass quietly through the system. It was seized under the Video Nasties crackdown and treated as material that should not be distributed. Authorities did not attempt to refine it or reshape it. They removed it. What made this film particularly threatening in the eyes of regulators was its simplicity. There is no deeper framework to interpret, no psychological distance. The violence exists without explanation or resolution. That lack of context makes it feel unpredictable. And unpredictability is what triggered the strongest reactions during the early 80s. Governments were not just concerned with what films showed. They were concerned with how those films might affect viewers when there were no clear boundaries or messages to guide interpretation. The result was immediate suppression. Copies disappeared from shelves. Access was restricted. The film became part of a growing list of titles that defined the Video Nasties era. And by the time it reached this point, the pattern was clear. The more chaotic the film felt, the more aggressively it was removed. They were not just banned, they were hunted, seized, erased. Because for a brief moment in the 1980s, horror stopped being entertainment and became something authorities could not control. And when control disappears, fear takes over. So tell me, which one of these would you actually dare to watch?